I started working at the Washington Post more than 34 years ago, and I often tell people that it was the golden age of journalism. Ben Bradley actually hired me as a young copy editor at the Washington Post. So I've experienced what I call the golden years of journalism, when they said newspapers could print money. They were making so much money. And I experienced the turn in the industry, as well as the rebound with the digital age of journalism. So I think I'm optimistic, because I believe that journalists have incredible skills. They have an incredible skill set. They're great at adapting. We can write a story. It used to take us maybe 2 weeks to write one story, then 2 days, and now 2 hours or maybe 5 minutes. We have.
I thought you were going to say 2 minutes.
That happens. People will post in less than 2 minutes. So it's incredible how the reporters and editors have been able to adapt to this new age in journalism and post stories really quickly, because of the competitive nature of the web. So I think we'll survive, and I think we will survive because journalism has to survive. It is crucial to our democracy. As you know, we are watchdogs of the democracy. Our mission is to seek the truth and report it. And if we stay true to that mission, it will, I think we will still have readers.
Yeah, it's good to be in a newspaper town where you still have thriving newspapers, because the Post is doing much better than most. I always like to, I know sometimes people say print is dead. I like to say print is different, that it's not dead. Because people are still reading, but it's in different forms. And everything has changed. Everything has been disrupted, whether it's airlines or health or education or the media. And so some people weren't ready for the changes or didn't adapt quickly enough. So they suffered a little bit more than others. And everybody's habits are changing so much, partly because of not just technology overall, but specifically cell phones too, because you can do everything on it, and they're getting so much information. But it's interesting also to see the Washington Post, how it's, because I remember when they had their website based here in Virginia, and then they seemed to kind of consolidate more and then expand more digitally to invest more money into that area.
Yes, I was in the newsroom when we were, what are they doing over there? And I think it was Al Gore who called it the superhighway. And we're like,
oh yeah, they were saying don't be roadkill on the superhighway.
Yeah,
back then. Yeah.
Sort of along with what you said about, print isn't really dead. At my school at Washington Liberty, we actually still operate a print paper, so we'll run stories on our website, and then every few weeks we'll also put out a print issue of the paper. We're actually just getting started working on one now. But the really neat thing is that while we do have our website and we do have, student and staff traffic to our website, and that's a really great way that the alumni keep in touch with, how the school's going and what's happening in the community. A lot of people in the community really still like having that tangible paper. We'll drop some off at the central library, put them in the main office for visitors. We have teachers who ask us to drop papers off for them and for their classes. And you'll see students walking around with the papers in their hands just because it's something tangible. So sometimes it's easier to do that way, just because you have something physical that you're focusing on and you're reading, and you can see the story in print and see how it develops, which is really neat.
We have the same experience at Howard too. A lot of the students, they want to hold a paper in their hands. And we have a website that focuses on magazines, but we're going to print it periodically. We've been doing it mostly online, but the students really want to hold it in their hands too. So we're going to probably do it once a semester.
But do they want to read the Post or whatever in their hands or online? Because
the newspapers, they tend to seem outside of the campus paper, and they seem to read online a lot.
Right.
sometimes you see them because there's papers there, but a lot of times they're reading them online.
Well, what you said about it's not that print is dead, it's that print is different. That reminded me of when I got into the newspaper business in 1984. Everyone was saying the same thing. Print is dead. And the threat then was TV, that no one's going to read a newspaper because they're going to watch TV, and print has survived. And it seems that it's just an industry that's constantly in crisis. And whether it's the price of newsprint is going up or something's happening with readers. And I agree that I do think that the written word will survive. I think one question is, what quality will it be? And that the papers like the Post they're safe, but what about the local papers where, like you and I started, that are shells of what they used to be, and the money is really gone? And did you work at anywhere but the Post before you got there?
I went from college to the Post, but
how lucky.
when I was in college, my first job was at the Coffeyville Journal, as a little town on the border between Kansas and Oklahoma. And I often tell students that I was a sophomore in college, and I was granted this internship. And I remember thinking, I don't really want to spend my summer in Coffeyville. And one of my professors said, you will go to Coffeyville. So I spent my summer in Coffeyville, and I wrote a lot of front page stories there. And from there I went to what was called the Wichita Eagle Beacon. I have
Okay,
experience.
so you've done your time, and
I did my time.
Yeah.
Those smaller papers.
Yes, I did.
Well, I was reading a story today by, I think, Ken Doctor. You probably know who he is, like the business genius who's talking about how local news is, someone used this phrase, it's a distressed industry, which is like the Wall Street phrase for what you talked about, the airline industry and the healthcare industry, and it really is. And distressed industries, you have consolidation, and there's enormous consolidation going on, in that you just had Gannett bought by, I forget who bought it, so you now are down to basically 5 newspaper chains. And what is that going to mean in terms of the quality? And are these newspapers, I guess, just going to become franchises where they're like McDonald's? You can't tell one from the other. And I think that's one risk you're going to have, is that local news is going to become homogenized in a way that it never has been. So like I worked at the Providence Journal in Rhode Island for 7 years, and that's part of a chain. And when I was there, it was a family-owned newspaper, which was, the holy grail of newspapers. So we had lots of money, and money wasn't an issue. But now the design of the paper, because it's not designed in Rhode Island anymore, it's designed in who knows where, someplace 1,000 miles away, and it looks physically indistinguishable from any other paper in the chain. And that's part of consolidation, is that you have one person doing design for 300 newspapers, as opposed
and
to
you have
one
a centralized copy
That's
desk
right.
and things like that.
Everything is centralized.
Yeah.
And
I think that's a big problem. Yeah.
In what sense?
Because everything gets homogenized and you don't get the flavor. I was reading something that was saying that it's affecting like voting, like local elections, because in some places there's more food deserts where some communities don't have a daily paper. They might still have a weekly paper or something like that. But if the chain's pulled out, that they're not getting news about whether it's zoning boards or it's the people running for the mayor or just things going on in their state, or in their community. So I think that's a big loss if you don't have that. In some places, people have stepped in and started local sites, and that's good. But I think you really need to have something there for people to kind of get the information.
And that homogenization of the news sources, particularly, that small local print news, that's when the content becomes so critically important. Because, I'm a student newspaper, so I'm about as local as you can get. We have a community of 2,400 people, so we're pretty small. But the content, when you're focusing on those small stories, those local human interest stories, the ones that really tell the story of where you are and what the people there are like, that's one of the things that really makes it stand out. And having a small local paper like that, even if they're not covering, the big news of the day, having those stories, the ones that communicate what this place is and the real stories behind the people there, that's when it becomes really critical to have that.
I'm hoping some of these partnerships kind of help, like ProPublica has that local network, the local reporting network, where they're working with smaller papers and some of the other groups that are doing that. So, because it's kind of pulling out some stories or giving people the resources to get the stories done.
Well, to what Abby was saying is that there's, you were talking about something really important, which is the idea of a newspaper or news organization being an institution that really unifies the community and brings it together and gives everyone a sort of a common, cheat sheet or whatever that they can all relate to it. And other people talk about, well, it's got a watchdog function, and that's what ProPublica is all about. And I think sometimes that the watchdog function is oversold. And as much as I love ProPublica, if they just swoop in and do one or two projects, that's great. But what really keeps a newspaper viable is like the obituaries and stuff. I mean, I used to watch
I had
people.
to cover those.
Didn't we all?
Yeah.
I would watch people sometimes. In my first job in the small town Pennsylvania, I'd watch people in the coffee shop read it, which was a fascinating thing. And the first thing a lot of them would go to, police blotter, which of my friends got busted last night, or did my neighbor, and that's the kind of stuff that people would pay, whatever it was, 50 cents, 25 cents for. And that's the kind of stuff that ProPublica is not going to put money into police reporting and stuff.
Well, their model, they're not swooping in so much. They're supporting the people who are already there, so that they can do the stories local to give them the resources. But there has been a lot of talk about some of the larger stations and publications that are swooping in, that don't doing drive-bys essentially.
Right.
So.
And I mean, we'll cover a lot of localized, bigger issue news. We've done political stories for the state and the nation. We've talked about some of those big issues, but the stories that always get people's attention and get us the most people interested in what we're working on are those really local, small stories. And the issue we're talking about might only affect the student body, but that's still a big thing that we need to be talking about. Like, for instance, my school, we used to be Washington Lee High School. The name got changed over summer by the county. And for about 2 years, we were working on just a steady coverage of the name change and what it meant for the students, what it meant for sports teams and their uniforms, what it meant for the facilities, what it meant for our county budget. And those were some of our biggest stories, not because they related to, a larger national issue of how do we judge people based on their actions when they're historical figures. It was because of how much it impacted the community we were serving. So.
Well,
That's good that your paper does that.
They say all news is local. That's what they say. I think citizen journalists are filling in the gap, and I think before the decline of the industry, a lot of that local news was really fed by community activists. I mean, I covered local beats. I covered Fairfax County schools. I covered Prince George's County schools. And really the reporters on those beats, we're going to school board meetings, we're talking to school board members, we're talking to the superintendent. But the real people who knew the scoop were community activists and the PTA presidents. And they were doing the work on the ground, and many of those sources would call up the reporter and say, hey, did you know this happened at Washington and Lee? So I do believe that community will, at that level, those community activists will remain engaged in collecting the news. And now there's not necessarily a buffer between them and publication. So people are publishing their own work on the web. And so I still think that information is getting out.
I agree. I think the risk is that there's no quality control. And that's the beauty of a news organization with a hierarchy, a structure, editors, and
Right.
a rough set of values, and one of which is avoiding conflicts of interest. And news is coming from all sorts of places that you never would have expected it to. Like, the NFL has NFL.com, which is a news site. Now, it's owned by the league, so it's got reporters covering the league that funds it, but it's competing with ESPN.com and SportsIllustrated.com, and that's where you're seeing, non-traditional sources that aren't devoted only to news are sort of taking on news as an adjunct to what they do. BuzzFeed is another good example. It started as a game site, and now, they have news. So, I agree that there's always going to be an interest in news, but I don't know what the format it's going to take. And also, when you get to citizen journalists, what that does, and my fear is that it drives down the value. Because if you're talking about someone who will do it for free, then who's going to pay me? And how am I going to have a career as a journalist if I compete with a volunteer? I can't. And that's where I think what you're seeing is the money is disappearing largely from news, especially local news. And when the money goes, I think that the quality goes with it. So it's almost like there are two worlds of news today. There's the national, which is in many ways doing very well, like the Post is doing very well, and E&E News is doing very well, and the New York Times and so forth are doing well, and CNN is doing well. And some of that is due to Donald Trump, like him or not. He's been good for the news industry. And then you have the local news, which is really, really still trying to figure it out and still going through these consolidations and cutting, and it's very hard. When I was working at USA Today, I worked at USA Today for 12 years, and I was trying to get in touch with a reporter for the Gannett paper that was a chain in Jackson, Mississippi. And I went onto their website, and they had a grand total of 6 reporters. And this is in a state capital, 6 reporters covering. I was blown away, and needless to say, I couldn't get anyone to help me because they're all spread out so thin. And, they don't have the time like you had the time to get to know people in the Fairfax schools and really, understand the context and where the stories and the people. They're just running around, plugging holes.
The Post still has a very strong local news section. It's producing amazing stories right now. And although the staff is not as big as it was when I started, you still have reporters covering beats and a strong local section.
I am a 7-day subscriber to the Post, and I always read the local section. You're right, it's very, very good. As I say, the Post is a real outlier.
Yeah,
Cause
well, I couldn't go back in the newsroom without defending my local reporters. Of course, in the old days we called it Metro, which stood for Metropolitan. But yeah, Metro is strong, and I think the people who work in the Metro section are very good at collecting news and writing news and telling stories. And as you know, the power of a good story, whether it's considered national or local, lives. It has strong readership. Those narratives that local reporters are producing and some national reporters are producing do really well on the internet.
I'm glad there is a strong paper here because of some of the changes that are going on. Every now and then we'll have people debate whether our campus paper should go online like some other campuses have, or whether we should continue to print. And I kind of feel, because I'm a journalist at heart, that as long as newspapers still exist, that we should still produce a newspaper so that, the students can learn on the newspaper and go work for newspapers as well.
Right.
So do you have advertising in or you're all funded by the school?
We get a certain amount of funding from the school. We also try to go around selling advertisements to, small community businesses, local groups that we'd like to work with. But we are fairly limited in that respect with our funding. We would love to print in color or print more papers. We don't have the finances to do that. We're lucky to be able to do what we are with our print publication and still maintaining our website. It's a lot, but the school values us, I think, and we, particularly with our alumni, we have a lot of support from them, which is really helpful. I mean, without them, I don't know how much we would still be doing. They're some of our most regular readers, which is great, but...
Support, like financial support?
Some financial support. We'll occasionally do subscriptions. We're trying to redevelop that so it's easier for people to get access to our paper. But their continued support of the paper by reading all the stories we put online and looking at our Twitter and everything, it really helps cement us as something that's in the community to stay, because we've been around since the school opened back in, I think, the late 20s, early 30s. So we're a long-running institution, and we're proud that our alumni are helping us keep it that way.
That's good. What do you want to do after you leave college?
I'm hoping journalism and astronomy. I'm looking at a double major, because the interesting thing about journalism is if you study something else in college, it's so applicable to the field, because you can write about anything. I mean, you were talking about environmental reporting earlier, political reporting. You can really study anything and have a way to apply it to the field, which is, I think, such a great way for it to stay strong, because you can get so detailed about so many different subjects.
Yeah, that's one of the things I've always loved about it. I always felt like that you learn something new every day.
Absolutely. I mean, I've had stories where I had to cover whether it was school policy or an environmental issue that some club at the school was trying to tackle. It involves so much research sometimes to get that story, but when you do it and you look into it, it gets so much more interesting, and you're able to add such an interesting layer to that with the extra information.
So you teach at Maryland, right? What do your students, what do they say they want to do when they get out of college? Or
I think some of them want to be investigative reporters, some want to be magazine writers, feature writers. Of course, some people are going into television. Some are multi-platform editors. So they're really well trained to go into the business.
Yeah, we have the gamut too, and some want to go into sports, so it's a little bit of everything. Some want to cover politics.
Right, yeah.
And business.
when I was at teaching part-time at Maryland, I used to tell students sports is great. I used to look down on sports like a lot of reporters in the main newsroom do. They look down on the sports as, oh, those are, they're just writing about games and stuff. But they may be writing just about games, but they have incredibly loyal readership. And if you can get to be a star columnist, you can actually move the numbers. I'm sure you've seen that with people at the Post. The best read columnists, well, maybe not the Post, but you got some big name sports columnists there, and it's people will always want to read about sports. It's just one of those things in a way that people won't always want to read necessarily about their city council. People get attached to sports in a way they don't to their city councils.
Yeah, from high school all the way up to pro.
Mm-hmm. That's true. Yeah.
But yeah, so one of the things we always tell students too, some of the ones who want to cover sports, is they have to be able to cover all types of stories, because if you're covering sports, you have to be able to do a business story or a real estate story or a health story, occasionally a crime story. So there's a lot of different intersections with it. And just like how the Undefeated is, it's focusing on like the intersection of culture and sports.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of the great things about doing sports, particularly at Washington Liberty. I love how there's so many different directions we take our sports section. We'll have some sports features in there, pick players and go in depth about that. One of our staffers right now is just starting to work on a story about concussions in high school athletics, and how that impacts not just the teams, but the academics, the culture around it, how that's combated. There's just so many different ways you can discuss sports, and you can take it as big as you want with, a team and an entire league, or you can just get it down to a single group of people and how they're interacting with their community through whatever team they're on.
So one of the issues with sports coverage these days is that, newspapers had value because they aggregated a lot of different stuff. You'd get your news, your local news, your national news, your sports news, your business news, everything, and it was the only place you could get that aggregation. But now it turns out that people don't necessarily want that aggregation. People only want to read the sports, and so why should I pay, $2 for the Washington Post when all I care about is the Redskins? And why should I even subscribe online to the Post when I can get everything from ESPN.com? And I think part of where you're seeing the news business going is that this notion of aggregation is being blown up, and it's becoming specialization, so that you're going to go here for your sports news, you're going to go here for your national news. So you're going to go to the Washington Post to get your Washington news. You're going to go to ESPN.com to get your sports news. You'll go hopefully to E&E News to get your environmental news or whatnot. And the internet makes it easy, and whereas in the pre-internet days, you're not going to buy 5 newspapers, and that's one of the challenges that local news has, is that it was valuable because of the way it aggregated, but the aggregation is no longer valuable. So where does it make money? And still no one knows the answer to that question. And these mergers keep going on, and the only answer that people seem to be coming up with is economies of scale. But I don't think that's a real answer, because that's a path to oblivion in my mind. If you think you're just going to cut your way to profits, which is what news organizations have been doing for a long time now, eventually no one's going to want to pay for you if you have so little value. No, so it's easy for me to sit here and say, here's what's wrong. Don't ask me what's right, how you do it. I mean, there are nonprofit models out there, but I don't. Those have some problems too.
Well, it's a big experiment, like you said. No one really knows where it's going. It's like
nobody knows,
because we're really in the middle of a media revolution. It's kind of like the birth of radio, the birth of TV, and it could go in a lot of different directions. So, I mean, one of the nice things about like students and like for you coming in and things like that is because you can kind of help shape where it is going, or kind of contribute to that. And a lot of people are experimenting with different things.
Yeah, I think particularly with the way it's going now, the use of, social media and the internet has become such an interesting topic, because so many people I go to school with, they'll get their news through news alerts that they get on their phone, or they'll just go on Twitter and check it there. So we're trying to sort of do that now, build up our social media presence, because we know that's where people are going for their news, so we want to be able to provide that for them there. The platform we use for our website, and some other schools in the county are doing this too, but you can make an app for your site, you can develop it on social media, and you can really sort of connect with your readers more that way. And that's another way to sort of cement yourself as this publication that really caters to your community.
Yeah, that's really important, because some people just want that soundbite, or they just want to, because you have to be able to reach so many different people. Some people want to read a long piece, and some people just want to hear what happened, and not, just get the 5 W's and H and move on.
Absolutely.
I think when news breaks, people want to know, they want to go to sites that they trust, because sometimes you'll see a headline on Twitter or maybe Facebook, and you're like, holy cow, is this really true? And I find myself, I'll go to, of course, the Washington Post.
To verify
if the Washington Post is reporting it, I know it's true. And of course, the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and CNN, other places. But I still believe that those outlets will survive, because I believe that people want to know the truth about what's going on in a crisis or locally.
It's really important these days.
Yes.
Well, the brands have enormous value.
Yeah.
And I hope newspapers do everything they can to maintain the value.
I find myself sometimes going to websites, click, and finally you use up your articles, and,
Right.
and I'm like, okay, I will pay for this because I really want to read the story. I really think our readers and our audience has to get engaged in a way that they don't mind paying $1, for news that they can trust.